Hello, Prestige Heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Oren Ziv. Oren is a journalist with 972 and Local Call, and he's also the co-author of the recent Erasing the Lines, How Settlers Are Seizing New Regions of the West Bank for the Nation, and that is what we have invited him to talk about. Oren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I think the first thing maybe to do for people who might not be overly familiar is could you tell us a little bit about the West Bank, how it differs from Gaza? What is its legal role in the Israeli state project? How is it viewed? So people might be aware that there's something called the West Bank and there are settlers there and they're kicking out Palestinians. But beyond that, they might not be aware sort of how it functions. So could you let that be known?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for asking this. So generally, the West Bank was occupied in 67 by Israel and was never officially annexed like East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. So basically, the Palestinians living there are not residents, are not citizens. They are under control of Israel. Israel affects all aspects of their life, from going out, going in, arrests, permission to go into Israel, every detail of goods going in and out, but they don't have any status in Israel. And Netanyahu, I think his biggest project in the last 30 years was not Iran and not other things. His project was to kind of normalize the situation, the status quo, and making the Palestinian issue a non-issue. And he quite well succeeded in it before October 7th, 2023. So the election beforehand, just a few months before, in the end of 2022, no political party, maybe just Meretz, the social democrat left that didn't press the threshold even on those elections, nobody talked about the Palestinian issue, Palestinian state, even annexation. Yeah, Ben Gvir and his crew, they spoke about annexation, but back then they were quite small. So Netanyahu really managed, at least we're talking about the center and the center left, and also, of course, the right, to make the issue a non-issue. So since, and more specifically, since the end or the official end of the Second Intifada, most Israelis don't go to the West Bank. They don't know on the map where it is. They don't care. They see Palestinian workers entering with permission or without permission Israel, and that's it more or less. When I worked in a local newspaper, I would tell people I would go to the West Bank on mainstream media. People would know on the map where's Ramallah, although it's closer to Tel Aviv than Jerusalem. So it's really and it's not only Netanyahu; it's all the Israeli system making. And you might as well say that this kind of separation started with the apartheid wall, the separation wall that was erected in 2005, 2006. And this is also a psychological barrier for most Israelis not to think about the West Bank and as well Gaza. And it's also part of the media narrative that mainstream media just doesn't report about daily life in the West Bank, only when there's wave of violence towards Israelis, attacks. Same for Gaza, but a bit different. But in general, that's the theme. So most Israelis either don't know what's going on there or choose not to know, of course. And the West Bank, just maybe last sentence, the West Bank, according to the Oslo Accords from the mid 90s, is separated to Area C, where all the settlements are located, but also all the open areas, the Jordan Valley with the border with Jordan, and not and also a few hundreds of thousands of Palestinians live there. And this is, according to the Oslo Accords, officially controlled fully by Israel. Then you have Area B that is officially controlled by Israel security-wise, but municipality-wise, planning-wise by the Palestinian Authority. And then Area A, the big cities, Ramallah, Jericho, Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarem, Hebron, that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, both security and municipality-wise and planning-wise. Theoretically, Israel should not enter there, although it happens all the time. And this, according to the Oslo Accord, should have been the base for a Palestinian state, where you have Palestinian police and Palestinian ministry, then offices and so on. Of course, on the ground, it's not like that. And we can see today by Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, that is also a second minister in the Ministry of Defense, when he's talking about what will be in the West Bank, he's talking that Palestinians will be um, pushed to this 6 or 7 cantons that are of the big cities, places he understands that right now he cannot push Palestinians out, and the rest of the territory, Area B, Area C, will be controlled fully by Israel, and Palestinians will be pushed to those cantons that are kind of aligned with the Oslo Accords if we're talking about Area A.
So, just one quick question. What is the macro strategy here for Israel? I think this is worth talking about in light of the war in Iran. Um, Israel wants to obviously annex these territories to expand its borders. It seems to me that unless they're doing full ethnic cleansing or genocide, this is going to be territory that will be difficult to control. Um, they clearly are making some, to my mind, bid for regional hegemony vis-a-vis the destabilization of Iran and Syria and Lebanon. That seems to be the plan, just destabilize them forever. At the same time, I think they have cost themselves medium term, maybe even short term political and military support in the United States, which makes this an incredibly unstable strategy because they don't have the military industrial complex, or we like referring to it now as a defense industrial base, to actually maintain this strategy. So it seems to me like this is, cutting off their nose to spite their face a little bit. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Likud and the far right's political strategy, which to my mind has just now become basically embraced by every Israeli as far as polling could show. Um, but you could let me know if I'm wrong about that. But what is the larger picture here?
The larger picture, I would say, is the same policy like in Gaza, as we've seen, on statements of politicians, but also on the ground with the genocide, the attempt to push Palestinians, all of them, out of Gaza. You could say, at least theoretically, they would want to do the same policy in the West Bank. How do we know it? Settlers have been placing billboards with photos from Gaza of the displacement from northern Gaza in the beginning of the genocide, saying, writing in Arabic, there's no future in Palestine. And they've been putting it in the West Bank, for example. Since even before the war in Gaza, settlers, since the beginning of this extreme government in the beginning of 2023, they've been promoting for major changes in the West Bank on the ground, which the final attempt is to show Palestinians you have nowhere safe and it's better to leave. People are not leaving, a bit like in Gaza, but the concept is the same. So, for example, after mass pressure from settlers and settler leaders, not only the extreme settlers, as they like to show in the Israeli media, to say there's extreme settlers who attack Palestinians and then the mainstream settlers that are okay in the West Bank. Uh, since the beginning of the war in Gaza, they've been promoting for mass operations in the refugee camps in North and West Bank, places that have been also a place of armed resistance to the Israeli occupation. Jenin refugee camp, Tulkarem refugee camp, and Nur Shams refugee camp. And Israel displaced all the residents, all of them, tens of thousands of people that are already refugees from the Nakba from 48, displaced them with no other solution, just illegally took them out, and they're operating in the camp, but the armed groups that were there were very, very small and not of huge effect. It's very clear now they're basically just demolishing houses, opening roads, which we know in Gaza in the beginning, when the policy of demolishing houses, when you'd ask the army, they would say, yeah, we're not demolishing houses just for collective punishment or to create a future nobody can come back. We're demolishing houses for military causes, to open a road, for safety. And in the refugee camps, they're not demolishing all the refugee camp yet, but they're, because those refugee camps are very dense, a lot of buildings on top of each other. So the official claim is that they're opening roads so it will be easier to control and to operate. And they even say that in the future the army will be deployed there. But to conclude this point, the idea is to change the reality in the West Bank, not exactly like in Gaza. They understand they cannot do it fully, but there's been a lot of changes, giving settlers weapons and making a lot of settlers part of the reserved army, meaning that settlers that Palestinians will meet as civilians and would harass them now has much more force and authority, promoting new settlements. It's not. We'll talk later about the investigation, but it's not only the outposts or the illegal outposts, even according to the Israeli law. It's the government decision to build dozens of settlements all across the West Bank, and which is aligned with the idea to push Palestinians. And the bigger picture is to say, and I think, you know, this is related to Gaza also. I think in the end of the day, after October 7th, uh, Netanyahu, that wanted to do all this normalization with the Arab world, doing peace without talking to Palestinians, this of course collapsed. And one of his last legacies, putting aside Iran, is just to make sure there will not be a Palestinian state. He said it, other people say it. And I think all the policy in the West Bank is just to make sure there will not be any future for Palestinian state. You know, we have a lot of criticism on the two-state solution and how it was, you know, used by Israel just to gain time and never, you know, the Oslo Accords, how they were shaped also in the fact to maintain the control in the occupied West Bank. But even like, you know, the official Israel that always, you know, was talking in two voices on the ground, the extreme right, Netanyahu, talking officially about Palestinian state, on the ground doing the opposite. Now it's all shifted. Now also the official Israel talks against any future of a Palestinian state or any peace agreement, and that's what I think we're seeing on the ground.
So, Aaron, I want to go back to talking about areas A, B, and C, the Oslo designation, because that's really central to your what you found, which is that these outposts are cropping up a lot more in Area B than they used to. But maybe we could start by talking about Area C. I don't want to say that Israeli settlement in Area C has become normalized because I don't think it has. But at the same time, it feels like when it gets talked about in the U.S. at least, there is this sort of like, well, Area C is under Israeli control, so naturally there's going to be some. Not that we condone it, but that it's just sort of this is a natural thing that can happen. But Area C is still Palestinian land, right? I mean, you're still kicking, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians around, taking away farmland. Like this is still land that they rely on. So can you first talk a little bit about what it means to have settlements, expanding in Area C, and then we'll get into your
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah, the idea in the Oslo Accords that it will happen in steps and very slowly. And of course, we have to remember back then there were much less settlers in the West Bank than today. Um, so since then, a lot of, the biggest settlements today in the West Bank are ultra-Orthodox cities that people also were moved there by the government because of cost of living and because many ultra-Orthodox didn't have place in Jerusalem and in Bnei Brak, the two main center for ultra-Orthodox in Israel. So when we're talking about Area C, yeah, we're talking about the settlement, but it's important to say we're talking about roads. We're talking also about the security area around settlement. So the settlement has the planned area, which of course, according to international law, is completely illegal, and also according to some of Israeli regulation and how Israel defined the land. You have many ministers and army commanders and people who live even inside a settlement in places that were not really legalized or on our private Palestinian land. Then you have a lot of what is called state land that is based on the Ottoman law, that land or a plot of land that is not uh, cultivated or worked on for a few years become a state land. It was an Ottoman way to take taxes, and Israel used it. So today, a lot of the settlements or the outposts would be on the edge of what they call state land, on the edge of a Palestinian land, or on the edge of area A or B. And then people say, yeah, it's a state land, but the fact it's state land doesn't mean anyone can come and build there. Obviously, in Tel Aviv or inside official Israel, you cannot just come and do whatever you want. There's planning, and and second of all, this state land is also part of Palestinian land, of the open areas, of the farming area, grazing area for many decades, or even more. So Area C is very crucial because it's a bit more than a bit less than 50% of the West Bank, but it's all the Jordan Valley, for example. A huge
Right, the
part.
water, yeah.
Yeah, the water, the agriculture, and and settlers didn't have enough with the official settlements. The outpost was the beginning of different outposts from 20 or 30 years ago, but to the new outposts that are using farming and grazing, same tactics of Palestinians, was the idea to control all Area C, to make it fully Israeli. Today, we heard it in the investigation. We spoke to Israeli soldiers, and they told us and we also heard it from Palestinians, that today in Area C there's no argument. A soldier would come to a Palestinian and say, you cannot graze your sheep here, you cannot be here, this is all Israel. Area C is Israel for soldiers and for settlers. This has already been annexed de facto in their mind. I'm not talking about, of course, international law or justice wise or anything like that. So Area C in their mind is completely um, controlled by Israel. It's important to say that also in Area C, Israel has the planning authority, so they can enforce house demolitions. Palestinians cannot build there a new room, a new shack, whatever, a new structure for the animals, anything from a toilet, like Israel confiscate mobile toilets that people place in the Jordan Valley. So it's full Israeli control. A lot of soldiers, a lot of settlers patrolling there. Settlers in recent years also got budgets not to have only the soldiers and the civil administration that control Palestinians, but also each local council has kind of like officers that patrol and harass Palestinians and look for new construction. They use drones and other methods to kind of spy on Palestinians, to monitor them, and then to report to the Israeli authorities. Those officers, by the way, that of course are paid by the state, um, were also a crucial part of the eviction or the forced eviction of Palestinian communities in Area C that we've seen in recent months in the Jordan Valley, places that uh, the state would want to evict, but they're using settlers, they're using outposts, they're using the daily harassment, the fact the police and the army, in the good case, just stand on the side, in the bad case, help it actively, arrest Palestinians, harass them as well. And then the Palestinian community is forced to leave. They don't have a choice. They sometimes the sheep or other animals that are being stolen, they've been arrested. They decide to leave, and then for the state of Israel, the official state, it's much more easier because when you talk to the army, when you talk to the state, to other officials, say no, people decided to leave. It's not like forced eviction with trucks and even house demolition with a bulldozer that doesn't look so good uh, sometimes or always, but it happens that the people kind of
It's
the state say
it's
they just left.
voluntary,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
it's
Like
voluntary.
we
Uh,
gave them the choice between staying under constant violence or leaving, and they chose to leave. It's not our
yeah,
fault. Like, that's the logic, it seems like.
yeah, and if in the past, area, and it's important to say, even if you look at the left, not the left, the center kind of political, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, other figures, for them, Area C, nobody's of them. Even if you talk to them, if you talk to them to Yair Lapid on a Palestinian state, he would say, yeah, there's no partner, it's not the moment. But if you dig in, they will like, of course, they will agree all the big settlements will stay. They're talking just about the extreme outposts, the places that generate the daily violence, the specific violence that also is not visually very good for official Israel. So this is all Area C, and it's important to say that in recent years, the settler, and specifically since the beginning of the war in Gaza, so settlers have extended. They finished with Area C. They gained full control. They pushed away over 70 or 80 communities, and they're advancing. A, because they can, nobody stops them. B, because the Palestinians they deported go usually to area B or A, and then they go after them. And we heard it also just last week. I was in the northern Jordan Valley, and I heard from people who were pushed away that the army and the settlers told them, go to area A, don't go to another area in other area C. But also in area A, settlers come, harass them, uh, act with the same violence. Just a month ago, after a settler was killed while patrolling in Area A, Palestinians said it was a car accident. The army and the police classified it after pressure from the right as a terror attack. After the settler was killed, settlers erected 5 or 6 outposts in Area A. It was a bit too much for the official state. Also, CNN crew was attacked there, also in Taisir in the northern Jordan Valley, and those outposts were removed, not without violence towards Palestinians, of course, uh, as kind of a revenge from the settlers' side. But afterwards, the same outpost just move a kilometer or two, a few miles, less than a mile, moved to Area C, still controlling Area A. So even if the outposts are not in Area A, they're in C and B, and they're controlling. And it's not, till a few years ago, settlers would not feel comfortable to go in these areas. Today, they know that they have full support of the army, of the police, and they just feel free to patrol, to walk with their sheep. Just a few days ago in Dir Shrir, that is also area C and B, settlers went in, Palestinians went to try and stop them. There was also a bit of stone throwing, and the settlers called the army, those units that are settlers that are part of the army, but they're serving in their own villages, in their own settlements. A soldier settler came and shot a Palestinian and killed him. And for the army, it's very comfortable because they said this was the soldier was with full uniform and with a rifle. But the official response from the army was that he was a soldier on vacation, like off-duty soldier. So on one hand, he has the authority, he has the weapon. On the other hand, the army doesn't have to explain why he was inside a Palestinian village because this was not a official patrol of the army. He just came here there with his friends to harass and also eventually kill a Palestinian.
So let's get into your piece, which talks about the growth of outposts in particular in Area B and the movement, and even some in Area A, but really seems to be happening a lot in Area B. And maybe the first thing to clarify for people would be distinguish between an outpost and a settlement. The outposts are sort of the genesis of these things, right? It's like the acorn that gets planted illegally, even under Israeli law, but then eventually, the status is kind of reified by the state and it becomes a settlement. Is that basically how it works?
Yes, correct. Basically, almost all settlements in the West Bank started like this: that settlers come into an army base, into a nature reserve, into a hill. They started, and with time, they convinced the state to recognize it according to Israeli law, of course, not international law. And this is the case here. As I said, uh, when going to a hill and putting a few caravans, you control a few acres. Already a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, settlers leader understood that if you get from the civil administration some permission to graze a land, this state land that was used for generation by Palestinians, and you just put a tent or a truck and a few mobile houses, you can control thousands of acres. This happens, of course, with the support of the army, with what I talked before about the local council, the drones, the different units. It doesn't happen alone, it happens coordinated, but one hill, one family, a few volunteers, one flock of sheep. It costs, yeah, it's not cheap. Of course, they get sponsored for it, but you don't have to start to build a whole village. In the beginning, you can bring a water tank, a tent, and take over thousands of acres. And we heard it from Palestinians again and again. This outpost arrives. Theoretically, they have a permission to graze, but they don't show it to you. It's also not under freedom of information law for different bureaucratical reasons. And then they come to Palestinians, tell them this is the line, or this is the line. Places Palestinians have been grazing their sheep or using it as agriculture or open areas, just for hiking or for picnics or whatever. And you have over almost 200 outposts like this. Almost depends how you count. And later there, and especially under this government, they're being legalized very very fast. But the beginning, it's like this. Now also, so all of these are called outposts even in Hebrew in Israel because they're illegal by the Israeli law, or at least partly legal. But nowadays, under this extreme government, there's a new category. So they separate between farms, which are kind of, as we learn, are coordinated with the army in some level, and of course with the government, and they have hills. That this is more not always with sheep, and the more extreme so-called settlers, the more violent ones, the ones that also make some problem for the army and at least for the reputation of the settler movements. And currently in Israel, it's even under debate inside of the right because the violence passed some threshold of killing Palestinians, burning houses. Um, of course, because it was on international media, a lot of the discourse it's harming the legitimate settler movement. Uh, so also in Israel, there's at least the official Israel, they separate between the farms that are kind of good to the a few, maybe 20, maybe a bit more, hills that is kind of like, the people who don't coordinate with the settler leaders and the army, and they would be the one that will be in the front of attacking Palestinian villages, what they call the troubled youth who burn houses, burn cars. But of course, and I can elaborate later, of course, it's part of a bigger system. Uh, but both these hills and the farms are illegal also according to Israeli law. The government is working very, very fast. Just a few days ago, the government announced 34 new settlements, and many of them are based on those illegal outposts according to Israeli law. So always when they announce a new official village, it's most of the time it's already based on acts on the ground. Daniela Weiss also told me that when we were in Gaza border and we asked her about the settlements in Gaza. She said she's very open. She likes media. We've seen interviews with her. She's a settler leader, and she said we have the experience from the West Bank how to force the government to convince the government to do things they don't want. Because people ask her, many journalists, including myself, ask her, how are you going to settle in Gaza? It's even the army doesn't want it, even parts of the government don't want it. And this was, of course, before the ceasefire. And she said, we did it in the West Bank for dozens of years. We have the experience, we have the knowledge, we have the people ready, and we will do it in Gaza. And she's very convincing because they really did it in the West Bank for many, many years, of course, with the active support of the government. But in the beginning, they kind of convinced the government to support them.
So, talk about what you found in your piece. You reported in a number of places in the West Bank, the increasing number of outposts appearing in primarily Area B. There were some in Area A as well, but primarily Area B. And the other thing that seems to be a recurring feature, a theme in your piece, is that there's a level of sophistication to it. Like these people are following maps, and we'll get into the sovereignty plan. That's going to be my next question, but there seems to be a level of sophistication and planning that's going into where these things are located, that I don't know if that was there necessarily before, or if this is a new thing that people are noticing. But talk about what you found.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea was to dig in of how it works in a few levels. And I think the main finding is that settlers, according to a plan, after finishing with Area C, after pushing away dozens of herding communities, farming communities in Area C, they decided um, to focus on Area B because they understood that it's very easy to push Bedouin communities, farming communities, but in Area B you have a lot of built houses, you have towns and villages, with school, with municipalities, and it's much harder. So of course they started with the outskirts of the village with more farming communities in the edge of Area B or between Area B and C, but not so slowly. They're focusing on built areas of the villages. And the idea, and this is also from citing settlers and hearing from Palestinians what they say and seeing what's happening on the ground, the idea is really to make this feeling that there's nowhere safe, that there's no limits, even, and we're hearing it from Palestinians that were displaced, that they go from place to place and settlers go after them. And it's really, I think, also to, while the army is operating in Area A and as I said, demolishing the refugee camps and conducting arrests and operation, also normalizing a bit back to the situation before the Oslo Accord, that the army, was during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, the army was deployed in Nablus, in Ramallah, really controlling these areas. And it seems also now the army is kind of trying to make Palestinians feel it, and that they're everywhere, also in Ramallah. And I've been to army raids that they go into Ramallah just to take a stolen car, not to arrest somebody important. But Palestinians have been telling us it's to create the feeling that they're everywhere. So while the army is doing it in Area A in the cities, the settlers are doing it in Area C and B, and altogether it makes Palestinians feel it physically that there's nowhere safe, there's no place they can hide. There's no place you can just live your life quietly, because you're going to have the checkpoints between the cities and between the villages, and you're going to have the settlers raiding and the army raiding, and it creates this siege, also physically, but also, of course, mentally. Uh, Now, what we saw in the investigation, also speaking to soldiers, that this is a official policy, uh, to support. Soldiers told us that then when they arrive to places, to illegal outposts, to different events of violence, it's very clear uh, with who you have to stand and who you have to protect. And we hear it, we heard it with soldiers we spoke. We heard it also in the past. Also, soldiers don't know the authority they have towards settlers, because they live with them, they serve with them, they serve with the different units that are embedded with the settlers. And for example, myself, as an Israeli journalist, I was detained and even arrested many times by Israeli soldiers when trying to cover funerals or protests. We've seen many activists, both international and Israeli activists, being detained and violently arrested by soldiers. It's been all over social media and the media. But when you talk to soldiers, they don't know that they are allowed to stop settler, for example, if they see a settler committing an act of violence in front of them. So it's something we heard from soldiers. We also heard that the reaction to when Palestinians or Israeli activists, I mean, call for help, and when settlers call to the command rooms, to the control room, is very, very different. So all the system is designed to allow those things, to allow the land grab, to allow the eviction. It's not something theoretical. It's from the very, very simple soldier to Smotrich and the government that give the different ATVs and the weapons and the permissions to do so. I think another point that we saw in the investigation is that it's always worked according to some plan. So outpost is erected, settlers start to graze in the area, Palestinians are afraid to go out, they limit themselves, they stay in their houses. Then, sometimes it happens in the course of a few days, sometimes it can take months even. Then settlers start to invade houses, do search, find different excuses. Sometimes it's very, very violent and brutal, sometimes it's more just harass. It's also very violent, but not necessarily physical violence, just to intimidate the people. And then after a few days, sometimes it happened in a course of days, sometimes months, Palestinians decide to take the sheep out because they're afraid from stealing. Settlers would find different excuses to say we lost a sheep, it was stolen, and conduct these armed searches, for example. So people take the sheep, people take the women and the children out, and then the violence escalates. Usually there's one or two events of big attacks, and then people are forced to leave, and then settlers come, create more damage in the community that was left, and continue to the next target. At least, it's very interesting because in many of the places communities left, later settlers didn't stay there. They just wanted to kick the people and they moved to the next target, either because they really want to be on the front line clashing with the people, or either because they don't have enough manpower to be everywhere and they want, the most violent one to be in the front. One story we cover in the investigation was of the community of En Samia, one of the first communities in the between the Jordan Valley in Ramallah, East Ramallah, that was forced out before the war in Gaza in summer 2023. They were forced out after months or even years of harassment by settlers. And some of the families deliberately chose to settle in Area B, in the outskirts of the village of Murayr. A, they thought it would be quieter. Back then, there were no settlements in the area. And B, because it's Area B, they could build without risk of being demolished by Israel. So they built kind of a simple but very nice community, some houses, structures for the animals, even some small roads. Of course, these communities are usually not connected to water and electricity, so they had some solar panels and like a local water system. And then they sat there relatively quiet. But a year after, during 2024, um, settlers arrived also there, erected an outpost just on the edge of area C and B, and started to harass them. And despite its area B, the army came there, uh, did issued a closed military area, which is a very common practice of the army towards communities, because the closed military area applies to the activists. And many times without activists, the communities cannot survive. The activists don't give, they cannot protect them physically always. We've seen different cases, both for international and Israeli activists that have been severely injured and beaten. And if a few years ago it would give more protection, today the settlers have no limits. Just a month ago, a day before the war against Iran, two Israeli activists, one 50-year-old, one 70-year-old, were severely injured in Kusra, really brutally attacked with clubs. They were evacuated by helicopter to the hospital because their situation was so severe. Of course, a few people were arrested and released shortly after. Nobody's on trial for that, despite the fact that it's Israeli activists. So the army issues the closed military area, takes the activists out, and this small community, refugees of Ensamia, that are also refugees from 48, so people who are free, the third or the fourth time already refugees, they were forced to go out again. And this is not something unique. You hear it all across the West Bank, and we can talk about it in the next question. But what we found is that it's a system. They work according to a map. It's not something that happens by mistake.
That leads into the question of where the map's coming from, and it seems to be coming from Bezalel Smotrich. You mentioned him earlier, but his sovereignty plan for the West Bank, and that this involves, again, you alluded to this earlier, but the idea of pushing, if you can't ethnically cleanse the entire West Bank, you can at least push Palestinians into these very tight enclaves around the major cities, sort of the core of the Area A parts of the West Bank, and then everything else is fair game. What do we know in terms of uh, what Smotrich envisions happening here under the plan, and how that's connected to what your reporting found?
Yeah, the sovereignty plan is a old plan of Smotrich. Just now he's in power, so he can actually uh, make it happen very, very quickly. Uh, but the idea was, you know, to push Palestinians out, and the ones who are left here are in very, very small areas, also under Israeli control, or at least, you know, not anything close to a Palestinian state, to a Palestinian autonomy, nothing like that. Maybe local municipalities, but also controlled by Israel from all aspects of life, and basically killing the idea of any Palestinian, not state, but even autonomy or anything like that. Now, when you look on the map Smotrich presented a few months ago, he did a press conference, you really see the 6 or 7 cantons. They really play with the numbers to say there's only a few Palestinians in Area C, there's actually more people. Uh, the numbers and the figures don't come, they're not quite correct, how they calculate, there's many people in between those cantons, and still, despite everything, Palestinians are not living in the West Bank. They're living there, they're resisting by staying there. Many people, it's not so easy. In Gaza, they didn't succeed to push, despite all the horrific bombing and starvation and everything. In the end of the day, the plan failed, despite the horrific price Palestinians pay in Gaza. The plan of the government to push Egypt, to open the borders, to take people in planes to Jordan, this failed. It doesn't make the situation there better, but the political goal failed, and it's important to remember it towards the West Bank, because they're, in the end of the day, they're creating impossible conditions, but people are not leaving. They're pushed from here to there. They're suffering from extreme violence supported by the government, but they're not leaving. And by the way, if you look on the map the government published just a few days ago of the 34 settlements, you can see it exactly, because even just these 34 that add up to 19 more, and a few dozens more since the beginning of this government, you really see on the map how they're surrounding the Palestinian cities. They're really blocking. They're not, these are official settlements, or they're not on area B and A, but they are around them, also in places that were evicted during the disengagement in 2005, where Israel went out of Gaza. Also, a few settlements in the northern West Bank were evicted. And this connects also to a new wall Israel is building in the Jordan Valley, and basically changing extremely the situation on the ground. I think from the beginning of the war, from the settlers on the ground who push violently Palestinians, who kill Palestinians on daily basis with the weapons supplied by the army, to the big governmental plan, the idea is to use the fact that everybody's looking at Iran, everybody's looking at Gaza, everybody's looking in the beginning and the situation in southern Israel and the hostages, to make facts on the ground. And politically, they know that even if a less extreme government is elected, Bennett or anything else, those people internally in Israel won't have, won't want, or will not be able to bring back the situation. The maximum you can expect from this kind of right center, if Netanyahu will be replaced, is to kind of stop or slow down the process because of international pressure, because they will want normalization, because maybe the US administration will change. But from the past, we know, that they're not very good in removing or changing things the extreme right wing did in Israel. So I think it's really changed the reality on the ground. And as they say it, as the more extreme settler says, and then also people in government, they say that all this policy starts from the outposts. We've seen Minister Amichai Shikli visiting the outpost that from in Area B near Kusra, that from that outpost, the attack against the two Israeli activists happened. From that outpost, a Palestinian was killed in front of his father. Many, many events just in a few months this outpost exists. And we saw Minister Amichai Shikli visiting there and saying how important it is. The only thing he said about the violent acts, he said bad things are happening here and it's bad for us. He used very, very vague words, but he said it's important to be here. This is a strategic point. And this happened after we published our story. But he said we need to erase the terminology of area B, A, B, and C. We've seen it also after the death of this settler youth a month ago. We've seen billboards uh, across the West Bank saying there's no more area B, A, B, and C. So also Smotrich spoke about it. It's really becoming our official policy. I think if in the past it was what the settlers do on the ground, and then the government is kind of keeping it vague. Now it's completely different. They're talking about canceling the Oslo Accords, that everything belongs to Israel, settling everywhere. And this is a shift from recent weeks that we've seen. And if I may add, there also, while this discourse is happening internally in Israel, uh, because also mainstream media and because I think CNN was attacked by uh, settlers in army uniform, or and we've seen the settlers telling them all the West Bank is Israeli and we're here to revenge and so on. So and also other events, there's been a discussion internally in Israel about the extreme settlers and the violent settlers, the one on the front, because Netanyahu just 3 or 4 months ago said to Fox News these are 70 troubled youth. And of course, A, being on the ground, we see it's much more. And B, we see how they get the support. We know that those people could not do anything. And we hear it also from Palestinians. The fact they can go into a village and set up or set on fire a mosque or kill somebody or go with their sheep inside is because Palestinians know they have the backup of the whole army and police and armed settlers. If not, they would be pushed away by Palestinians, obviously. And I think also this, in the end of the day, this kind of small group serve the biggest problem, the biggest purpose, because they're the front line of the violence, of the harassment of the Palestinians. After they complete the job, comes the official Israel and recognizes settlements and does the other things. And of course, we've seen in different videos the attack of the two Israeli activists, but in all other occasions, those so-called extreme settlers are using the ATVs supplied by the government. They're using the people who accompany them are either soldiers or settlers with army weapons, and so on and so on. And of course, if the army and the police would want to stop it, they would stop it in a minute. They would stop funding it, stopping. The control of the army across the West Bank is so massive. If they wouldn't want the attack to happen, they would block it. Of course, Ben Gvir is controlling the police. The West Bank police district is barely functioning. Not that before it was great for Palestinians, but now they're barely investigating anything. We've seen the commander of the West Bank police saying that it's more important for him to to protect the settlers, he said residents, but he meant settlers, of course, than to maintain law and order, which is a crazy thing from a policeman to say that he prefers, you know, to protect settlers than, that the safety of the settlers. And this is basically giving a green light to any attacks, because if you ask the settlers, and we heard it from extreme settler Elisha Yered, he says that when we take the clashes into their villages, we protect ourselves because they don't come to us. So he talks about, and he's kind of a very extreme settler, but also very honest. So he talks about how you need to move the line into their territories instead of uh, Palestinian trying to resist the settlements in different ways. The fact that you go into their villages and push the line towards them makes them busy with protecting themselves, protecting the land, and then they cannot attack you. I'm translating his words, of course. And it seems, in one hand, the official Israel is trying to say, yeah, the violent settlers are not part of us. Even Smotrich admitted there is some problem. Even Amit Segel, a very notorious right-wing reporter, talked about Jewish terror, a term that you would never hear. You would almost never hear on mainstream media, for sure not from right-wing reporters. But on the same time, while this is happening, the kind of gap between the official Israel and the settlers on the ground is becoming very, very minimal. They, with this current government, they get any support they want.
Thanks. That was really comprehensive and really useful. We just want to ask about a couple things. First, what about these recent Knesset votes on first expanding Israeli security control in areas A and B, and then also, quite dramatically, doing a land registry in the West Bank, and how that might be related to annexation? As Michel Foucault taught us, once you start registering things, you start being able to control them. So, what's going on there?
Yeah, they extended the so till now, as I said, Israel violates the Oslo Accords on a daily basis, going to Area A, arresting Palestinian, either for acts of violence or just for social media posts, being parts of NGOs that Israel didn't allow, or just showing force. Yesterday they were in the market of Nablus. The army is really trying to normalize the fact the army goes in and out. If in the past, in order to go to Jenin camp, they needed 100 trucks and D9s and APCs and this, today they're driving kind of really going back to the 80s, that the army was inside the Palestinian towns and villages and so on. But this law makes it plays to the settlers, ideology, because it means that if somebody is burning trash in Ramallah and this makes pollution, you can go in for environmental reason. If there's an archaeological site that you get information that Palestinians are not taking care of well enough according to your perspective, like a place that historians or archaeologists will claim it's a site important for Jewish history. You can go in and protect it and take things from there. These are all things that have been happening here and there, but this becomes much, much more official, that they can act. It's basically canceling the Oslo Accord, just very, very, uh, very slowly. In the end of the day, the army and the Shin Bet and some of the old establishment, if there's any left, they're enjoying the Oslo Accord. They're enjoying the fact that PA is taking care of the Palestinians. Of course, there's many criticism against the PA, corruption and other political criticism. Uh, but for Israel, it's very comfortable, that they're managing it. They're also arresting people in the name of Israel, passing them to the Israelis. There's a lot of security coordination, and this is very comfortable. And the changes they are making at some point will pass some threshold, and the Oslo Accords will stop to exist. And this is just another level to do so. Settlers are always focusing on archaeological aspects, especially one who can and there's different NGOs that are dealing with archaeological things from a radical perspective and a political perspective, but settler and right-wing groups are always looking to use historical sites to prove that they can control the West Bank and to push Palestinians out. We've seen it in different cases, and this law about Area NB can make it easier for them officially to operate in these areas for not only for security issue, which is political, but also for things that are civilian, like as I said, archaeological, environmental issues, civilian issues. And about the land survey, we know this didn't happen for dozens of years. So, of course, it's very worrying because the authority who will do it, it's Israel. So, of course, we expect, you know, results that will fit Israel. And the fact that even now that, it's not big numbers, we're talking about 80 or 90 communities pushed from area C. It's not huge number. It's a few thousands of people. But even those people will not be registered in area C, for example. They will be registered in area B or A, and so on. So the idea, I think, this land registry is will if it will happen, and if it will happen in the way we think it will allow to gain more control on more land, to say more land is state land and so on. It's also, there's another law legislation that says, uh, because till now, buying and selling land in the West Bank was only through the civil administration, and it had to be approved. So Israel is not like in East Jerusalem, that Israel is either buy land or fake buying lands, and by that, or bring some documents that, with the we won't go into that because it's going to be a totally different episode. So in East Jerusalem, we see a lot of cases that Israelis and Israeli groups and NGOs managed to get control legally on Palestinian houses. We won't go into all the background, and we see it less in the West Bank because till now, even according to Israeli law, there were some limitations of Israelis buying Palestinian property in the West Bank, and also this the government is uh, changing. So I think one of the reasons they're working so fast is because they maybe understand that Trump might be replaced, that the Israeli government might be replaced, and they want to use the momentum they have, that they have unlimited power to change as many facts on the ground as they can. They created this situation. I think it's good for them that people are arguing on outposts on area B or A, or the government, evicted a few outposts in area A. So then, as you said, uh, in area C, there's no argument. This is already Israel. Nobody, even if the government is changed, nobody will talk about evicting even outposts on area C.
So, or maybe as a final question, we haven't, I don't think, maybe you did and I just missed it, but I don't think we've mentioned the Palestinian Authority once
Yeah,
in this discussion, at least not in a serious way.
yeah,
Um, can you just talk about why they've become, or how superfluous they've become, I guess, to affairs in the West Bank, and what that means basically
yeah.
for the Palestinians?
Yeah, I think in recent years and under this current government, Israel has been working to weaken the Palestinian Authority, or what's left from it. I'll give some examples. There's a lot of Palestinian criticism on the Palestinian Authority. It's not my place to do so. I'm not Palestinian and I don't live under the Palestinian Authority. But of course, there's a lot of criticism against corruption and the fact they don't represent Palestinians, and political violence, and so on. But Israel is really working in order to weaken the Palestinian Authority on what's left of it. One example, in Jenin refugee camp, that you had a lot of armed groups that they were doing actions and also parades, and Israel was acting there. The Palestinian Authority last year did a 45 days operation there, killing people. Palestinian cops were killed, with a lot of criticism from Palestinians. And what Abu Mazen and his people said, they said, we're doing it so Israel doesn't do it. In general, in the West Bank, they're saying we're doing different acts of raids, or confiscating weapons or something, because we don't want it to be Gaza. We want to control the area, not give Israel excuse to operate. So they've been operating there for 45 days with a lot of criticism from Palestinians all across the West Bank and also outside, of course. And then when this operation ended, there were arrests, there were uh, gunfire clashes with militant groups inside the camp. When this operation ended that day. Israel started the operation there that didn't end till this day. And during the operation, people who ran out were arrested by Israel. Later, when Israel went in, people were arrested by the Palestinian Authority. Uh, so Israel has everything to weaken them, and this is why in Area C they're not allowed to operate. Not, of course, they cannot send cops or soldiers to protect Palestinians, but Israel is also limiting the work of NGOs or civil society organizations that try to support farmers, bring them food, bring them water, bring solar panels. Israel is working against it all the time. You see incitement of right-wing groups against them. You see confiscation of things. You're seeing blocking of this kind of aid, very humanitarian and simple aid. And then of course also in area B and A, they created a situation. The Palestinian Authority has nothing to do. For example, since the beginning of the war in Gaza, there's hundreds of more of administrative detention in the West Bank, meaning people are arrested with no trial, with no proof, just held for 6 months, and this can be extended usually for a few times. I visited some West Bank cities that many of the people who are arrested work in the PA. They work in the different security forces of the PA, and they've been arrested then because there's no trial and no evidence and nothing. You don't know why, but usually I interview one person who was arrested for 2 years, almost 2 years, 1 year and a half, since the beginning of the war. They came to his house in the central West Bank. They knew he was working for the Palestinian Authority. They asked, "Where is your weapon?" He says, "My weapon is in the office." According to, he doesn't go with his weapon outside. It's in the office, in the police station. Then they searched his house, and he was held for 1.5 year, although they didn't find anything there. So a lot of the people arrested and held in administrative detention, and we're talking about dozens or even more, are from the Palestinian Authority. It's official policy of Israel to make them irrelevant, to make them, even in the small area that they were functioning, to make them to make it impossible to them to do anything. And I think in the end, when Israel raids the Palestinian cities, they let them know, don't go out or you'll be shot. So when they enter Ramallah, Tulkarem, all the different cities, they call the Palestinian Authority and tell them, we're going on in from this and this street, and don't show up. So on the ground, they have nothing to do in the current reality towards the Israeli aggression, from the outposts we talked to the big raids.
Maybe just as a final question before we wrap, is there any hope here, or are we witnessing, end state, United States, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s? I mean, it sure seems like that,
Yeah.
that we could be witness to ethnic cleansing, population displacement. But it seems like we're kind of in the end stages here, and that Oslo will have been viewed as a bit of a farce from a macro historical perspective. And the two-state solution, I mean, it remains for future historians to decide whether that was always a dodge or whether there was a real chance. I don't know. Doesn't seem. I mean, it's not going to happen. So maybe you could end on that. What do you think the future holds?
Yeah, it's a good question. I understand. Many times we think about it because, to be honest, when we publish those stories in Hebrew, also settlers send them on the groups on the social media and say, "Look, what great news we occupy." Because for sure, the more extreme one, they're not shy. They use the word occupation. They use the word displacement. They're not embarrassed in what they're doing, uh, and it's important to say that the reality on the ground is very, very harsh and depressing, but at least me, as somebody who goes and document and also spends a lot of time with these communities, it does give you hope with the people who remained on the ground, with the activists that insist to be with them. It's very small and not always on a big scale, but some communities uh, are still staying. Not everybody was pushed out. Many communities were pushed out, but others not. You see also Palestinians in the villages, in the town, trying to organize with night shifts, with patrols, with different, very small tools, because they cannot organize, of course. Uh, they cannot protect themselves by force when they're standing in front of armed people that have the support of the army and the police. But you see different initiatives, people staying with families, and and if you talk to Palestinians, despite the fact that many activists, both international and the more anti-Zionist Israelis are doing protective presence, like being in communities of risk of displacement. And the fact that it doesn't always help, and sometimes it fails also when communities leave, Palestinians in those communities and other that were not displaced still ask for it. They ask for this presence. They feel it gives them some solidarity and some sense of protection. Not, not 100%, maybe not 10%, but people really feel it gives them some opportunity to resist, to document the fact that international or Israelis allowed them at least to film, to call the police, to speak in Hebrew or English, to kind of delay. And even when you talk to Palestinians that were displaced, they said without the presence of the activists, we would be displaced much, much more earlier. Now, there has been also attempts of Palestinians to go back to the villages, especially places that even legally, according to the occupation laws, they owed the land. This was very hard. Uh, Usually it didn't succeed because settlers really push back when they see it happening. But I know the community is planning and trying to go back. And I think again, I mentioned it before. On the big picture, uh, it's important to say that some of this process, if the political conditions change, some of this process it can be changed. Like even now when in Israel internally people are talking about settler violence, it's enough that the government takes their ATVs and their weapons, just this, that settlers cannot go with uniform and long rifles and without the ATVs. Even this kind of small change can really change dramatically the situation on the ground for Palestinians. So even if there's a bit less extreme government that change a few small things on the ground, it can, at least for the Palestinians on the front line, it can really make some difference. Of course, we do need a wider and bigger political change that will allow justice and freedom, but also on the ground, some things might change in the near future, or at least improve a bit.
Well, Oren, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on the show. I'd learned a ton, and your article is excellent. Everyone, check it out. Link in the show notes, and we'd love to have you back again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.